Welcome to another section of HST 306, the Veteran Experience. I'm Dr. Stevens, of course, and we're going to be focusing on Civil War veterans in this period of our class. And of course, the Civil War veterans are veterans that certainly saw a great deal. And to have survived that war is quite an accomplishment, right? Brother against brother, a nation torn apart, and all of those pretty significant cliches that we bring up in terms of the Civil War. So let's move forward and let's talk about those who actually served, the demographics, the numbers, and then we'll move along to some points of analysis. The key to understanding the veterans of the Civil War is understanding what they went through on the battlefield, and really the horrors of that war are really what drove them once they went back to their respective communities to really band together and create the veterans organizations that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And so, to give you a sense of this, and so, obviously, many of you have studied the Civil War, whether it's at the college level, even at the high school level, and certainly many of you I know are Civil War buffs. But to really give you a sense of this, it isn't even to this day that there's really an understanding of how many people perished in the Civil War. There's not really a significant understanding of how many people were wounded, of what type of casualties were in the war. And so I put together a list here of the soldiers and the numbers here in terms of who fought and what happened to them. And these numbers are from a variety of different academic and government sources. And of course, we have trouble in terms of documentation because there are many people that didn't just enlist; they took up arms, particularly in the South. But we recognize also the fact that it just was such a devastating war. It was a difficult war to keep track of, right? So at the start of the war, there really was a parity in terms of who was fighting on either side. So by the time the Confederate Army and the Union Army had pulled themselves together, there were about 200,000 men on either side. But by the time we get to halfway through the war, the ratio is very different, and it becomes 2 to 1 in favor of the Union. And among those people that served in the war, we know that it's somewhere between 2.1 and 2.75 million men who served in the Union. And we know it's about 750 to about 1.2 million in the Confederacy, in the Confederate Army. So most of the numbers for the Union tend to go toward 2.75 million because of enlistment contracts. And one of the things you really should recognize in terms of the men who fought in the Civil War is that, much like what we were talking about with the Revolutionary War, these are men who are volunteers. These are men who have no real military experience. Now, in terms of the upper echelon, in terms of the officers, in terms of generals particularly, you're talking about men who did have significant experience. Some of them had even been trained in military academies, but a vast majority of them had served in the Mexican-American War. And that's where we see the real professionalization of the United States Army and the military as a whole in the Mexican-American War. So when you're talking about the upper echelon of the military, you do have some significant military experience. But in terms of the Civil War and the men who were fighting on the ground, the men who were the grunts in terms of the Civil War, you're talking about a vast majority of men who enlisted, who were volunteering, and who had absolutely no training whatsoever, and were given very little training as well. And it's not until World War I and then certainly in World War II that we see a significant effort to not only mobilize men for war, but to also give them significant training before they're put out into the battlefield. So rewind here to 1865, that's not really happening. So we have an all volunteer army here. We have a conscription that will occur much later on in the war that doesn't garner a lot of men into the war. It's mainly men who have chosen to serve, and this, of course, is what happens in the Confederacy as well. And the Confederacy doesn't have as much of a problem of getting men to enlist for the cause. And so that's why you see at the very beginning where there's that parity in numbers. So as we move through the war, we certainly see the fact that there's going to be, again, this disparity in terms of who's fighting in the Union, who's fighting for the Confederacy, and that the Union has much greater numbers. But at the start, particularly in terms of the idea of who is going to be signing up for this, it really was much easier for the Confederates to get men to sign up and to really take up the cause, and it wasn't quite as easy to get that done in the North. So let's focus on the dead, and this is really important in terms of um, the post-traumatic stress symptoms that Civil War veterans are going to have. It also means a great deal in terms of the push that many of the veterans of the war had after they went back to their respective communities to join Veterans Association and to push for particularly a creation of a very particular identity for Civil War veterans. And that's because of the fact that they really did see significant horrors in this war. And you're going to recognize within this war that there is new technology here that's going to change the way that not only the war is performed, but also the way that men will internalize the war and the horrors that they see during the war. And so, for the number of men who perished in the war, we have sort of a broad range. The more accepted number is around 625, 640,000 for the Union. There's the possibility of up to 850,000. I broke it down here in brackets between when we're looking at around the 600, 650,000 figure, that we're looking at 360,000 for the Union and 250,000 for the Confederacy. Well, not all of these men died due to warfare, right? And we're probably looking at about 100,000, 150,000 on either side who died because of warfare. The other majority of them died because of disease. We also have the wounded in this war, and the wounded are the ones that are obviously going to put on a concerted push, and their former comrades in arms are going to put on a concerted push for disabled homes and creating some form of system for disabled veterans. So we have a significant amount of wounded on either side. We also, as we discussed for the Revolutionary War, and the idea that for the United States, the first time you see POWs, there are POWs in this war as well, about roughly 30,000 on either side. But there's a lot of missing and captured men, and there are a lot of deserters as well. So on a whole, both for the North and the South, we have about I would say about 500,000 if you want to take an approximation here. Another thing to address is the ethnic makeup of the people who served. There's about 170,000 African Americans who serve, about 3,500 Native Americans who serve. The Native Americans are not going to be enveloped into any sort of pension system. They're not going to be enveloped into any sort of benefit system, right? There are many African Americans that are, I think it's about 80,000, that end up becoming a part of the pension system. So African Americans were treated much differently in terms of this war for the Union, and they were given a great deal more than Native Americans after the war. But that those 80,000 that actually got some form of benefits fought really hard for those benefits as well after the war, and it was very difficult to get them, and then they eventually got them. But the ethnic makeup here obviously is extremely important, especially considering what these men are fighting for in the Union, right? That they're fighting for the abolishment of slavery in many ways. Now, again, one of the problems that we have in the Civil War is that one of the issues with getting men to enlist was that there really wasn't a very significant focus on a cause, right? there was at the very beginning this focus on, well, the South has no right to remove itself from the Union, and that's what we're going to be fighting for. And then there were some people who joined up in terms of the Union who were joining because they actually wanted to see um, the abolition of slavery and thought that by the Confederacy being beaten, that there would be a way that the Union would be able to, and the United States of America would be able to abolish slavery. But there's not a whole lot of white men who are joining in the Union in order to stop slavery, right? Their vast majority are fighting against the South and the idea that they broke apart the Union. Of course, in terms of the Confederate side, they were very particularly fighting to maintain their way of life. Enveloped within that way of life, obviously, was slavery and the economic benefits and the social benefits for whites in terms of the enslavement of African Americans. So they had a much more focused cause than, say, we had in terms of the Union. So that obviously funnels into the idea of who would enlist and how long it would take men to enlist. But it also funnels into the idea of the fact that African Americans joined up, and they certainly joined up in terms of the Revolutionary War as well. But this was a much bigger issue for them, obviously, with the Civil War. And so we're going to see how the men who are focused on the idea of the abolition of slavery, particularly African Americans, are going to be treated not quite as well after we move into the post-war period, and they're not going to get the benefits that they believe that they deserved, even though many of them who fought, who happened to be slaves and had been runaway slaves, actually gained their freedom, obviously, and that is certainly a big deal. But in terms of being able to get any sort of benefits from the government, they have to fight really hard to get it, and it's less than the amount of men who actually fought in the war who get those benefits, right? And those were really hard fought for as well. So, in terms of who served here, we certainly have the idea that, when you look at these numbers, when you look at the casualties, when you look at the war dead, you can see just the enormity of this war, right? And it's certainly something, not to belabor the point, it's certainly something that we've known about, since elementary school, right? But really focus on this in terms of how you move through the materials and how you move through understanding the veteran experience after they go back to their respective communities, right? And think about the things that they must have seen on the battlefield that were horrific, and the trials and travails that they went through on the battlefield on both sides, and how that necessarily would, number one, create reintegration issues. It would make them feel separate from society, and would also make them want to band together and create more veterans associations slash organizations, right? And to really get their just due in terms of the war. And again, not just in terms of benefits, but also in terms of being able to shape their own identity and their own national identity. So very quickly, before we start talking about the actual veteran experience after the war, the number of veterans that we see in terms of the post-war period are going to be about 1.5 million for the Union, about 500,000 for the Confederacy. Those are the men who are left. There are also the disabled men who are enveloped into this as well. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about some of the contributions of the veterans in the post-war period. So the veterans of the Civil War, as I mentioned in the previous slide, really banded together after they went home to their respective communities. And they made sure that they not just became highly visible in these veterans organizations, but they also made sure that they were highly visible individually as well. And there are many men who are able to come home from the war and actually become really quite economically sound and viable in the new economy of this period that you're going to read a great deal about in the Gilded Age. And there were also men who became very successful politicians on the local and state level, but also on the federal level as well. So they were highly, highly visible. And the veterans of the Civil War within the Gilded Age really put a very significant stamp on the culture and the society of the United States. However, there were a great deal of those men, and we're talking, about in terms of the Union, 1.5 million men who went back home to their communities. Certainly, a vast majority of them lived very common and ordinary lives, right? And so, the book that you're reading, the full book that you're reading for this particular section of the course, really talks a great deal about those men, and men that the author really sees as marginalized men in many ways. So I want you to see the fact that there's a dichotomy here going on as well, that we're going to talk here about veterans organizations, but we're also going to talk about veterans who had difficulty reintegrating. We're going to talk about veterans who were economically quite a viable businessmen after the war. And we're also going to talk about men who were almost destitute after the war and really felt that they had lost a great deal of time being veterans. Remember, we talked about this, or being soldiers rather. And remember, we talked about this with the veterans in terms of the Revolutionary War, that they felt like they had lost time, right? And it was time that they could have been earning money for their family. It's the same thing in this period as well, except for the fact that this is a highly lucrative period in the United States in terms of the economy. And there are dips in terms of economic depressions, but there's also great highs in the Civil War period, and then also in terms of the post-war period, and particularly as we call it the Gilded Age, and we call it the Gilded Age for a very particular reason, because it's a time period where there were many Americans who were able to make a great deal of money, right? And they were able to create a much larger class, upper class, and also middle class for the United States. Now, in terms of the South and in terms of the former Confederate states, that's not going to be quite as true, right? The South is decimated from the war. They've also had a major shift in their economic system because of the loss of slaves, and they really have a hard time piecing things back together, right? And so they are not very economically viable. And those veterans of the Confederacy, they are going to be the men who are the most destitute. But switching back up to the north, we have a vast majority of men out of that 1.5 million veterans that are in the lower class of the socioeconomic status of the United States, and many of those men really feel as though they had been placed in that position because of the war effort and because of the time they lost because of that, and the time they lost because of number one, and I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, but number one, we have the issue of them being seen very differently by the American public and almost being seen sometimes in similar ways to way Vietnam veterans were seen. So that didn't make them very economically viable because people didn't want to hire them. But we also see that they had those that had some reintegration issues had difficulty holding jobs and had difficulties creating businesses, right? They really focused on those issues. They were focused on really how to make it through the day, right? So we really have some disparities here in terms of what we're talking about, and you'll see this in the book on the Civil War, that we really have some men are able to do really well in integration, and some aren't able to do that, and some are able to become very economically successful, and others aren't, and they're poverty stricken, and back and forth, right? So we have a lot of dichotomies in that, and I think that the book really points these out very, very well, so that you can see that out of the 1.5 million men for the Union, there are many different ways that they reintegrate into U.S. society, and there are many different ways that they internalize the war, and so on and so on. For the Confederacy, it's a little bit more
uniform in how they reintegrate. It's a little more uniform in terms of their economic issues that they happen to fall into, those traps that I talked about in terms of the decimation of the South and its economy. But something else that you also will see is that they will actually be revered more in their neck of the woods than the Union soldiers are. And those Union soldiers fall prey to some very significant stereotypes. So let's discuss a little bit in terms of the veterans organization, some reintegration issues, and the establishment of some very particular benefits for these veterans. And then we'll move on to those analytical questions that, like I posed in the last lecture. So in terms of the veterans organizations, you do have the very major veteran organization of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is obviously a union veteran organization. There are other smaller union organizations, but this is the main one, and this is the one that has the most political clout, and this is the one that has the most influence. The United Confederate Veterans is the major veteran organization for the men of the Confederacy and the veterans of the Confederacy. There are smaller ones as well in the South, but it's the United Confederate Veterans that's the really big deal core one, and they're the ones who lobby the states of the former Confederacy for benefits for their men. These veterans organizations, and as you can see here in this particular picture that I have here, the veterans organizations really focus not just on politics and benefits, but they also focus on the issue of commemoration of the war and the creation of a national identity for Civil War veterans. That participation in the commemoration of their war is piggybacking on what we talked about in terms of the Revolutionary War veterans, where other people were commemorating the war for them and other people were creating their identities for them. And the men who served in the Civil War chose to create their own identities, chose to combat any identities that were being placed on them by the American public, and they wanted to be a part of the commemoration and the memory of the war. It doesn't always work, as I just mentioned, but this is something they're highly active. This is another reason why we call them very highly visible veterans in terms of their return to their communities. They really put on a concerted effort to shape their own identities. Again, not always working. They put on a concerted effort to commemorate their war in the way that they want to commemorate. Doesn't always work. And then they also push really hard for benefits, and those benefits, they have much more success in that realm. But again, that always doesn't always work, right? So they create these really significant veterans organizations. And again, this is a continuity that we'll talk about because we saw this in the Revolutionary War, and we'll just see this happen over time in terms of the wars that we're going to be looking at, and very specifically thinking about the VFW and numerous, really a proliferation of these organizations in the Vietnam era as well. Some reintegration issues that the Civil War veterans had would be number one, economic issues, and I discussed that a little bit before, so I won't delve into that too much. But just the idea of really feeling, number one, as though they were sort of left out of the loop when they were in the war. They were left out of the loop when they came into their communities again. That it took them some time to get back on their feet again, and the economics and the economy really of the United States was passing them by. And so they lost a lot of years and a lot of earning potential in terms of those years. So they were really concerned about their ability to reintegrate economically. They also had significant post-traumatic stress issues too. This was something that was called the soldier's heart at this point in time. So it's not, this is obviously a new late 20th century concept, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? But we know even from the Revolutionary War that men suffered from this. So they had a name for it. They had a name for the emotional and mental health issues of the Civil War veterans. And again, it's called the soldier's heart. Um, PTSD really was something that caused some significant reintegration issues for some men, but I also want to make it quite clear that this wasn't on a whole. And it isn't in any of these wars that we're going to be talking about, right? Reintegration issues with PTSD, there are, significant emotional and mental health issues that can occur with a veteran. There are also veterans that do not fall into that mind frame, right? And they, for whatever reason, don't suffer from significant post-traumatic stress. They still suffer from it, but they don't have the significant issues. It all has to do with what you saw, what you didn't see. It has to do with your mental health status before you entered war, and it has to do with how you're accepted back into your community as well, as to whether or not you're going to suffer in a moderate way, in a minimal way, or in a significant way, right? And I know some of you obviously already understand this in terms of your own issues with the reintegration. We have the establishment of many different benefits for veterans in this period as well. And many of these benefits were things, again, as I mentioned, were pushed by the veterans organizations. But we see in the Civil War period that politicians, and not just politicians who served in the war, but many politicians are interested in really augmenting that system that we talked a little bit about with the Revolutionary War, and that has progressed, particularly because of the Mexican American War, but also the volunteerism of the frontier, and exploring the frontier and the professionalization of the American military. That will funnel into how do we take care of our veterans, right? So there's the establishment of soldiers' homes in this period, very particularly the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. And there are multiple different chapters of that throughout the country. There are also state-run homes. That is all they have in terms of the former Confederate states at first. Then they're eventually enveloped into the federal system as well. You see that these soldiers' homes are something that are not going to go away, right? They're not something that will those benefits will not be yanked. And eventually, this National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers ends up morphing into the Veterans Administration in 1930. So we see that again, as you move through this material, you can see those continuities, the evolution, the augmentation of the veteran benefit system. We have disability pensions that are doled out in terms of the Civil War soldiers and Civil War veterans. That's about $25 to $30 a month, and then we have regular pensions that are established quite a bit after the establishment of the disability pensions, and those pensions are about $160 yearly. Eventually, the Confederate veterans will be enveloped into that as well. That happens around 1900, a little bit after the turn of the century. So that's really what happens with the veterans in a nutshell, in terms of the organization, in terms of the reintegration, and in terms of the benefits that they're given in the post-war period. So now let's move along to some of those questions of analysis in terms of your book. For your questions of analysis, this particular section of the course, the vast majority of them come from the full monograph that you're going to be reading. Of course, you have multiple other shorter readings to do, but this particular book on the veterans of the Civil War is really a groundbreaking book. It also is significant in that it synthesizes the experiences of a vast majority of the Civil War veterans, as opposed to focusing on a particular group here or a particular group there, right? And you'll see that as you read the book, that the author really has a strong ability to synthesize materials about a wide variety of people, right? And a wide variety of experiences, and really gets into the nitty gritty of all of those experiences. So, again, a vast majority of these questions here are going to be related to that book, but not exclusively, okay? So, in terms of these questions, sometimes there will be repeats or reiterations of things that we were talking about in the previous section of the class, and that's because we're trying again to create some threads through the larger narrative of veterans history, and then also to create those sub narratives, those smaller narratives that we talked about as well. So in terms of some of these questions, they're going to be some form of reiteration, although they're going to be specifically tied to the particular war or wars we're talking about in that particular section of the class. So, in terms of national identity or the identity of a particular group of people in the United States, we're going to be talking about that throughout the course. What the veterans' identity was in terms of the post-war period, and then also who's really shaping it the most, right? And in terms of the Civil War veterans, even though there are many people who are able to shape stereotypes about them, they're also constantly batting that back in terms of trying to create their own national image and to take control of their own fate. So that's the first question here. How did the veterans of the Civil War take control of their own fate and their own national image, and were they always successful? And obviously, as I mentioned just a second ago, not so much, right? They're not always successful, and there are other people that drive their image as well. But they are really important in terms of veterans who really took charge of their own image regardless of how successful they were at it. We're also going to be talking a lot about class in this course as well. So how did economic class factor into issues of veteran reintegration and also into the public's perception of Civil War participants? So again, two veins here, right? How did your economic class as a veteran, how did that affect how you could reintegrate? And then also how did the public of the United States look at you as a veteran in terms of your economic class? How were disabled veterans treated by the public and by the government? This is a significant issue in terms of the Civil War because the number of disabled veterans from this war, not just because of the enormity of the war and the number of men who served, but because of new medical techniques that allowed them to live. We talk a great deal about the medical techniques that maimed many men during the Civil War, and the infections that people would get, and the many deaths that were caused off of the battlefield after they were wounded. But we also need to talk about the fact that there were a lot of veterans who survived this war too that wouldn't have survived in previous wars. So there are a huge number of disabled veterans proportionately to the other wars that the United States has already fought in, right? So, how were disabled veterans treated by the public? How were they treated by the government? Government clearly being how they were treated in terms of benefits, right? Also, we again will consistently talk about reintegration and issues of reintegration, and then also how there are other aspects of the identity of the veteran that people are toying with, whether it's the public, whether it's politicians, or whether it's the veterans themselves, right? So how did issues of PTSD, heroism, and notions of masculinity impact veterans' perceptions of themselves and the public's perceptions of them? And always keeping an eye on the fact that the veterans have their own perception, and that's a perception that they are trying to get the American public to absorb, but that the public's going to have their own perception of them as well. And sometimes that's a positive perception, sometimes it's a negative perception, sometimes it's a mixed bag, sometimes it depends upon your political persuasion, your support of the war, and on and on and on, right? As a member of the public. So there are numerous issues for the Civil War veterans that are going to shape how the veterans see themselves and also shape how the public sees them. And sometimes those factors are outside of the realm of anything that the veteran himself could do in order to create his own image, right? There's many ways that people view things like masculinity. So there's a lot of factors in here, right? Many different understandings of masculinity, many different understandings of what it means to be a hero, many different understandings about mental health issues, right? Especially in this period. We're also going to talk about benefits, 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 right? And how the benefit system evolved over time. So again, this is a carryover from last week, and it's one of those veins that we're going to be talking about throughout the course. And then I also wanted to bring up here the fact that as you're reading for this particular week, and as you sort of synthesize the Revolutionary War and the Civil War in terms of veterans history, and what continuities and what evolution change do you see, that you really want to start thinking about the experience of veterans and how they compare to previous wars and how they compare to things that you already know about wars, or even including the war that you may have contributed to, right? So think about this in terms of the experiences and how you can thread them together, right? And you're going to want to keep an eye on that for the past, and you're also going to want to keep an eye on it in terms of how you already feel about particular wars, and you can see how you can envelop that into the narrative you're creating, or you might be able to see and perceive things differently after you go through this course, and it'll change your viewpoint of a particular war and the experience of those veterans, right? So begin to think about how each of these wars are comparing, what the continuities are and what the contrasts are, right? Okay. So now let's move along and let's talk about some of those really significant conclusions that I and military historians and veterans historians would really want you to take away from this period of the course. Here are our major conclusions to draw from the materials from this week. And as I had mentioned before, um, these are the major issues that a military historian or a veterans historian would want you to see from the material. It does not mean that you shouldn't draw other conclusions, right? But these are the ones that we would point out to you. They also are the ones that will help you to create the major threads of the course, right? To string together these threads to create narratives for yourself, right? So these are the major issues, but you are going to see other things in the material too. And I want you obviously to see other things in the material. So don't feel like because you've found something else that you're focusing on that you are doing something wrong by seeing that, right? You have a plethora of issues to talk about in terms of this course. These are the major things that I want you to take away, right? So in terms of the Civil War material, something very important to recognize that we've already talked a little bit about is the fact that veterans worked really hard to shape their own national identities and the public's perception of them, right? This is the first major effort that we see because the veterans of the Revolutionary War, a lot of their identity was controlled by others, right? So this is a time when you really see veterans really banding together, and also individually trying to make sure that the public sees them in a particular light, and really trying to shape the way the entire public sees them, particularly as military figures, as veterans, and as citizens of the United States, right? And as I mentioned, it doesn't always work, right? So, again, another conclusion here to draw is that the public itself really saw many Civil War veterans in terms of stereotypes, right? In terms of understandings of them that really rivaled the way that Vietnam veterans are eventually seen, over 100 years later, right? For the men of the post-Civil War era, those stereotypes have a little bit to do with reintegration issues and mental health issues and disability, unfortunately, too. But a lot of it has to do with economic productivity. And remember, I mentioned that, and it's really going to be something that your author hits hard in terms of the major monograph you have to read for this section of the course, that there's this view that the veterans themselves think that they were left behind economically, and the a good chunk of Americans, particularly those of the middle and upper class, really looked down upon the Civil War veteran because they weren't a part of the economic booms of the second half of the 19th century, right? So they look at them as, well, you didn't contribute in that way economically, so you shouldn't reap the benefits of that. But if they don't reap the benefits of it, then they become impoverished, right? And then they're looked down upon even more. So it's really a vicious cycle that the author talks a great deal about, and I think it's a really interesting perspective on this. But it wasn't until a few years ago when I was reading books like the one that you have to read that I started to recognize that the stereotypes that are placed on veterans were something that we could trace so far back, and it's really it's quite shocking when you think about it, because of the fact that we now really talk a great deal about revering veterans and making sure that, at least from the public's perspective, that veterans are taken care of, that veterans feel that gratitude that we talked about in terms of Revolutionary War veterans. So it seems like it was always like this, right? Um, but in terms of where we think the roots of these issues are in terms of stereotypes, we think about the Vietnam War. And here we can trace it all the way back to the Civil War. So it's something to really keep an eye on as you move through all of the materials for the course, and recognize public perceptions are not always exactly what we expect them to be in terms of veteran reception, veteran reintegration, and really seeing the veteran as someone heroic or someone who should be revered for their experiences and what they've done for the country, right? A very interesting point that the author makes in terms of the monograph for this week is that Confederate veterans were actually received much better than Union veterans. And that had a great deal to do with the fact that, on a whole, the Confederate States had a very particular cause they were fighting for, right? And they really felt as though, even though the Confederate Army lost, that the men who fought for the Army really gave it their all and were highly loyal to the South, right? And so they really see them as heroes, and as heroes that tried to uphold their cause. And so that's clearly not what the Union veterans are getting. And again, like I said, it's not across the board that they're treated shabbily in any way, but they are treated shabbily in many ways. And so it's really interesting to see how the victors are really cast aside, and are really, as we go through this material, we kind of see them as being sidelined, and as much as their efforts were to make sure that that didn't happen, right? And so here are the Confederate veterans who are being thought of as loyal and as men who really fought for the cause, and it didn't work out exactly the way they wanted it to, but they fought hard, and they fought very long, and it was a well fought battle, right? And so they're revered and received much better than the Union veterans. And again, that's not to say that there wasn't gratitude for what the Union veterans did. It's just that there were a lot of other factors that are going to come into play, especially the economic boom of the latter portion of the 19th century, that's really going to change the way Americans look at warfare, and really change the way Americans look at what it means to be a man and what it means to contribute to society. This is all going to flip again as the United States becomes a imperialist power, and so as the United States becomes much more focused on world affairs, the idea of becoming a military man, whether it's a career military man or whether it's volunteering to fight for multiple endeavors, right? That they it 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 changes in the sense of, oh, this is something that, again, talk about loyalty, right? You're being loyal to the United States of America by fighting to make sure that the United States becomes a major power in the world, and then eventually by World War II becomes, the power of the Western world, right? So this is something that we're going to see flip on us. But in the Civil War period, because of the economic productivity issue, many of the veterans of the Civil War are going to be seen as less than men. And so that's some of those masculinity issues that we're going to be talking about. Also, there are veterans that had an extremely difficult time, somewhat in the South, but mainly in terms of Union veterans that had a very difficult time reintegrating. They felt left behind by society, and this had a lot to do, again, with the economic issues more than PTSD or anything like that. Yet there are Civil War veterans that suffered from psychological issues, that suffered from physical disabilities, that often made reintegration difficult, often made homecoming difficult, and also, again, changed the way that the American public viewed them. We also see a continuity here from the Revolutionary War, which is that politicians continue to use veterans' issues to further their own agendas. And sometimes those things work out in positive ways for veterans, and in many ways it works out positively in this era. And in other eras, it works out quite negatively, as we saw with the pension program for the Revolutionary War veterans. And finally, and this again is something you're gonna think about throughout the course, the additional threads here that are layered in terms of the VA system after each major conflict, right? So there are some significant additions in this particular period, particularly the soldiers' homes, right? So these are those very specific conclusions to draw. Again, draw more conclusions, draw your own conclusions as well. But these are the main things that I want you to take away from the really rich history of the veterans of the Civil War. So I hope you enjoy the materials for the week and the readings for the week. And I will talk with you as we move forward through the history of the veterans of the United States next time. Take care.